żeby przywitać pierwszego z naszych wykładowców. I feel honored to announce Professor Karol Borowiecki from the University of Southern Denmark. Professor Borowiecki is one of the prominent culture economists, globally ranked among the top 5 economists and is among the top 10 culture economists in the world. He's an author of numerous scientific publications in leading economic journals, and he is also a leader of prestigious European projects conducted within the framework of Horizon 2020 or ERC grants. He is holding a PhD in economics and economic history. He is a pioneer in the field of the economic history of the arts. That is the topic of this lecture, titled "What Drives the Creativity of Music Composers? Some Insight from Economic History of the Arts." Karol, I am excited to listen to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ola, and good morning. I have my microphone here. I was asked to talk about trends, and I think we should kick off by saying I think the most impressive trend nowadays, in my opinion, in cultural economics international is what is happening in Poland right now. So in cultural economics, we always had the kind of foundation, a couple of scholars like Dorota Ilczuk, Monika Murzyn-Kupisz, and some others who since a longer time have been involved in cultural economics internationally and well connected, reputable, and so on. But in the last couple of years, and I think this is is a trend now, in the last couple of years, a new generation of cultural economists from Poland emerged, like Wojtek Hardy, Aleksandra Wiśniewska, Bartek Jusypenko, Satya Rożynek, and Jarosław Działek, and others who really have a drive and really are visible, connecting, and publishing very nice and very strong research. So I think there is more to come. The first evidence is already this conference, so I think it's a very nice beginning. I will talk about other trends in the remaining of my talk. It will be about scientific trends, and to make it slightly more interesting, it will be based and around the question, what really makes a great composer, okay? What determines creativity of music composers? This will be based on historical data, on historical context, so we will kind of travel back in time. And this is kind of like one part, one emerging area perhaps in cultural economics. There are 2 handbooks which provide a relatively current and relatively deep and thorough overview of scholarship in cultural economics. The handbook on art and culture and handbook of cultural economics, and there the lists of topics are about 30, 40, 50 topics related, and including topics like creativity, creative genius, stardom and talent, and so on. So obviously we are not able to provide a wider overview of all these exciting areas, but what I will try to do is by looking at the economic history of the arts, I will try to cover actually many of these topics listed here, creativity and stardom and so on. You may wonder why history, so why the economic history of the arts? Now, I think, and I would like to argue, that history provides a very nice, unique setting to address many questions which cannot be addressed using more, mainstream, contemporary data sets. So to begin with, if we move sufficiently far back in time, we will be able to study the entire lifetime, the entire creative output of individuals, right? Because they are not with us anymore. So this allows us to really study the entire, life cycle creativity. It also allows us to look what happens into the future. So if we had famous or creative people in the past, what does it mean for the future? So in other words, we can explore the long term. History is also persistent, so in fact what has happened in the past matters for nowadays. So even if you do not care so much about history and care only about nowadays, well, it's always good to have a bit of an idea and an understanding of the past to perhaps predict and also understand nowadays a bit better. And then finally, and this is what me as a researcher, what I find the most exciting, historical approaches enable access not only to unique and really amazing data sets, but it also allows us to overcome mainstream limitations or limitations of mainstream research. And I will try to convince you about this later today. I think in this room we all care about culture. Some people do not care about culture, they care about economic growth, businesses, entrepreneurship, and so on. If some of these listeners are hidden in the room here, well, let me just show you this here very simple correlation graph, which shows you here the relationship between artists' location throughout the last 150 or 160 years in US cities, and the startup densities in the most recent years, a measure of entrepreneurship, of business activity, and it seems to be a very strong positive correlation, right? I'm not claiming that one leads to another, but all that we see here is that these two coincide, and I think this is quite an insightful graph. In my talk, I will address 5 different topics, beginning with a few words on migration. I will talk about geographic clustering and how it matters for creativity, emotion. So we will move a bit in the kind of psychological sphere. I will talk about war and if time allows, teachers, before a small conclusion. In order to begin, we need a data set. So I've spent a long time sitting in music libraries and reading hundreds, well, to be precise, 522 of biographical entries of music composers. And with research assistants, we have extracted the lifetime migration history of these individuals. So we have created a data set that records where each individual was in every year of his or her life. And this data I will show you in a second. But before that, during this process, it was very burdensome and time-consuming. I had the idea to perhaps instead write a computer application and to, in an automated way, construct a data set. And this is what we did as well. And so we have obtained a data set on 15,000 music composers, much less precise, less detailed, but still good enough to approach a number of research questions. And I think that especially this kind of data scrapping, the collecting data in automated ways, that this is a particularly fruitful and promising area. Some of us, some of you, Wojtek, you for example, are data scrapping, obtaining unique and really cool data sets. And I think there is much more potential in cultural economics to use these sort of methods. So once the data was collected on the top 522 composers, what was possible to do is to compile figures like this here, which shows us the relative importance of different parts of the world throughout time. Okay, so the last 600 years and which places of the world have played a role. Well, not surprising, we have Renaissance about here, and Italy, the number of Italian cities, very important for classical music. Later, Baroque, the classical period, and Romantic era, especially the Germanic cities. Well, to begin with Vienna, but also a number of other German, Austrian, or even Swiss cities. The beige area here, this is France. Doesn't seem as much, but in France the remarkable thing was that it was almost entirely Paris. almost entirely one city accounted for this whole here relevance. And as I will show you in a minute, actually Paris was by far, during a very long period of time, the most important location for classical music. The United States emerging here more recently. The rest of Europe, the kind of brown area, doesn't seem like much. It seems a lot to us because Poland is in it. And we have, and I have compiled here for you two new figures showing you when important composers were born in Poland. It all kind of begins with Piotrek z Grudziądza, Petrus the Grudziądz things. It has a Latin name as well. We have a bit of the kind of Polish Renaissance, perhaps, here, and a number of composers, and then it really takes off in the late 1700s and especially the 19th century, when the number kind of goes up. This is a red line. This is a proxy for significance, importance of music composers. It is a measure of the average word count of a biographical entry. So how long was a biographical entry here? Now there's a peak here. I think we all know that Frédéric Chopin was born about here, and kind of, you know, pushes up the quality. In motivation, perhaps, of why association of cultural economics in Poland should be based in Warsaw is maybe this graph here, or this map rather. I was a bit surprised actually to see how significant Warsaw is in terms of birth of composers in Poland. Kraków, of course, as well, very important, and a number of other cities. To observe here also is the fact that this is the birth. I haven't shown you here where they died or what was the main work location of these individuals. So often, or many of these little dots around Kraków, they ended in Kraków. They ended in the geographic cluster or in this city of culture, Kraków. This is here a figure showing you how mobile these individuals have been, and it's quite remarkable because what we can see is that only about 15% of these famous top 522 composers have been born in a city or in a place, and had their and this place was also their main work location. Okay, so these 15%, for example, would be those usually who are lucky enough to be born in a city like Paris, and then they spend their career in Paris. This was their main work location. A remarkable 60% have engaged in internal migration. This is within borders of a country, and actually we treat the borders as of nowadays. So it's a vast under estimation, but about 60% have been born in a place and then migrated to another city in order to spend their career there. So, for example, born in Lyon and then migrated to Paris. And almost 30% have been born in one country, like Frédéric Chopin, and then moved over to another work location, like Paris in this case. So I think what we can take from this graph is that a very high fraction of composers, well, almost all of them, have been remarkably mobile. And this not only on overall, but if you look throughout the centuries, the migration here is very, very stable. I don't think that this is a coincidence. It is probably, you know, a key or one of the reasons to become successful, to exhibit this mobility. The next thing I'm showing you here is a table summarizing the importance of cities, and it comes from the automatically collected data set from Groove, and it looks at the appearance of certain city names in a biographical entry, for example, of composers born in the 16th century. So it is a proxy for importance of cities. But even though we use here proxies, what results are some nice measures of the dominance of Italian cities during the Renaissance, Venice, Rome, and so on. And then all this is followed by Paris, and then Paris emerges as the most important city, as a predominant, geographic cluster for music. In some centuries, it is even, not far away from being twice as important as the second most important location. And it remains so actually throughout about 4 centuries, position number 1. Nowadays, or perhaps even late 20th century, this has changed after the World War II, which has pushed many composers out of Paris, and what happened then, New York has received this boost. New York has increased here in importance. In some of the estimations that I will follow will be the 18th century here, the kind of classical age of music. This is when some of the greatest composers of all times were alive and working. Paris, London, Vienna, the 3 cities will be among others in focus in the next part of my talk. Interesting is also Warsaw here. Once again, a very significant destination for music in the 19th century. Well, top 7th city, very strong indeed. The next topic is on geographic clustering. So we have observed this remarkable clustering of famous music composers. The question that emerges is, what does it mean for creativity? Is there a relationship, and in what direction does it go? Before we look at this, we need more data. So what we need is information on what composers have been composing and in what year. Because if we know the year of the composition, we know where they have been in every year of their lives, then we can match output to a given work location. And the next, or the kind of tricky aspect of this analysis is related to causality. So finding alone a correlation between clustering and productivity is not sufficient, because what could be the case is either that clustering makes people more productive. It could be, in theory, the case that bringing composers together, letting them interact, learn from each other, compete with each other, maybe interact with other creative people like visual artists and so on, that all this leads to productivity and makes them more productive. This is the one possibility. The other is that more productive individuals self-select and they decide to move to a geographic cluster like Paris, maybe to publish their work or due to other reasons. And without knowing here the relationship or the direction of this relationship, well, we are not able to really design efficient policies, because if it's just a self-selection story, well, why would you support geographic clusters? And actually, this is quite a big question also, outside cultural economics. Many policymakers and governments and so on, they try to create special economic zones. They try to replicate or create certain hubs, business hubs, technology hubs, and so on. Maybe a bit inspired by places like Silicon Valley and so on, but without the knowledge of the relationship, we are all a little bit, working in the darkness. So how can this be identified? Well, in the ideal world, we would conduct an experiment, a kind of laboratory type of experiment, where we would randomly assign music composers into a geographic cluster. So in principle, if we could conduct such an experiment with you here and you were all composers, I would just toss a coin for Andrea first. If it's head, well, I would move you to Paris, otherwise you can stay where you are, then Trina, and so on and so on. So this would be a random allocation, and then 10, 20, 50 years later, we would study their output and see, you know, how have they performed in a geographic cluster or not. Now, we cannot travel in time and use it here, and even nowadays, nobody would, or no artist or composer would agree to such a crazy experiment, but we can look for variables in history which are as good as randomly assigned. And I suggest, and you know, also kind of show this in the research, that the birth location, and in particular the geographic distance between a composer's birth place and a geographic cluster is a very good and exogenous predictor of clustering. So essentially, once you are born, you cannot change your birthplace anymore. Births are spread fairly uniformly over space, and if you are born, say, 100 kilometers away from Paris versus 1,000 kilometers away from Paris, you are, you know, more or less likely to locate in Paris. So you can use this sort of random assignment in order to study the causal effect of clustering on productivity, and the results are actually that yes, clustering matters. Those who are located in Paris, Vienna, London, and these sort of clusters, they are more productive, even up to about 50% more productive in a geographic cluster than they would be somewhere else. You could also follow up with a couple of placebo tests. So maybe you are, you know, concerned that it's not due to other composers, due to the peers, why individuals benefit, but due to some large city-specific factors, or due to the infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, and not because of the peers. So you could run so-called placebo tests and re-estimate the clustering benefit for large cities which did not have many composers at the point, or for historical clusters, so places that have the cultural infrastructure from the past but do not have so many composers anymore at the period of analysis. And there are no productivity benefits observed in such places, which really makes me conclude that it is very much due to peer effects, due to the presence of other fellow composers, perhaps other creatives, that creativity is higher. Okay. Let me move over to emotions. So this was a little bit inspired by the observation that, as I have seen in many letters written by music composers and biographical accounts, those who were based in a geographic cluster, while they may have been more productive, they were not often very happy there. So let's have a look here at emotions and how emotions matters for creativity. And this is kind of going back really to Aristotle, who said something along the lines, there is no great genius without some touch of madness. And then since then generations of psychologists and scholars in other areas have been exploring whether indeed depression, sadness, some sort of psychological anomalies affect creativity and increase or make people more creative. Much evidence was provided. I don't have really much time here to cover this, but the evidence, the quantitative evidence, is often not fully convincing, because again, it is the issue of causality is not dealt with. It could be, for example, the case that a genius composer, after she creates a masterpiece, ahead of the time, the piece is not understood, not appreciated by critics, and so on. She gets depressed, right? It could be the relationship could be the other way around. this scholarship also often looks at the overall lifetime output, and here the timing is quite important. When does a certain emotional state occur, and and are you composing afterwards? So what I suggest here, and it's also a bit contributing to a wider field of happiness scholarship, which is often struggling to obtain data on how people feel. There are well-being surveys conducted, but it's at a point of time, and it's self-reported and so on. So there are different issues with that. What I suggest to do is to extract the emotional content from the correspondence, in particular from hundreds of letters written by a number of music composers. So the idea is the following: do not ask somebody how she feels, but observe how the person communicates, in particular what type of words the person is using. And this idea actually is becoming more and more popular in psychology scholarship. You know, if I ask Wojtek, how are you today, he would probably say great, but maybe he's anxious, maybe he's happy, or whatever, angry at something. So extracting the emotional content from written correspondence perhaps will make sense, and this essentially builds on the idea of looking of certain words associated with positive emotions, with negative emotions, with different types of negative emotions. And then what emerges is probably the first ever about an entire lifetime covering well-being index for a small number of composers, but the coverage, the lifetime coverage, is quite unique. Since we know much about the individuals covered here, we have all the kind of lifetime stories. We can then qualitatively, in a first step, validate and consider whether the indices make sense, and perhaps they do indeed. So Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, his positive emotions, they are kind of rising during his teenage years. This was a period associated with the touring around European courts, Mozart and the family of Mozart in high demand by aristocratic rulers. Then the novelty kind of wears off. He returns to Salzburg. The cultural scene is not supported anymore by the local ruler. He's not welcome anymore by the European courts. Then he moves to Paris, which he hates, and his mother dies. And this is the low of and his positive emotions, and approximately also his negative emotions peak here. Now this is all qualitative. Instead, and I will not show you this, but you can look it up in the paper. Instead, you could run a model, a well-being model, and see what life incidences affect your emotions and in what way. And if you do this, what you will observe is something like composing another important piece or touring activity increases positive emotions and decreases negative emotions. Illness or death of a family member increase sharply negative emotions. So you find results that, well, on one hand side, I believe they confirm the validity of this unusual approach. On the other, I think, and this is even more interesting, they show that these music geniuses, even though they were, like ahead of their time and so different, so creative, they were human after all. They were reacting to everyday life incidences in a very similar way as other, mortals would. And then finally, using this, unusual data, I can study the effect of negative emotions on creativity. Also here, I have a random assignment. I'm able to study the causal effect of negative emotions on creativity. And what I find is indeed they do increase creative output. In particular, sadness, in particular episodes of well, coming close to depression are particularly related to increased creative output. Then let me talk here a little bit about war and creativity and migration. So this is based on a couple of papers that I have written actually a number of years ago now. Sadly, they kind of became more relevant nowadays than they were in the past. Essentially, well, one could ask, what is the relationship between war and artistic creativity, or between war and the careers, lives of artists? And historians, they have been, throughout decades arguing that war is bad for creativity. It is destructive, detrimental. However, empirical research has very often failed in identifying this negative relationship. And I have labeled this here the war art puzzle, and I try to kind of explain this by simply looking at different types of war, by differentiating, for example, among or between offensive and defensive wars. They are very different wars, perhaps, because what could happen, and now I'm speculating only, during an offensive war, budgets are moved away from, well, culture and anything less important to the expensive warfare activities. Whereas during defensive wars, well, many artists, music composers, and so on, who were not able or not willing to kind of defend their motherland, instead they decided to perhaps create, to compose, to do something that is well, also a sort of a duty, but in a different way. There are many examples of compositions that are, well, induced, well, inspired, or perhaps they became popular due to war. Now, well, one example, Edward Elgar's Polonia, in support for the Polish Victims Relief Fund in 1914. Shostakovich, Leningrad Symphony, soon composed after the Nazis invaded Russia. I'm not able to play you music here to kind of convince you of this, but let me just show you here very quickly 2-3 visual artworks. Franciscus Goya, 3rd of May 1808, a war-inspired piece when the Napoleonic forces invaded Spain. Guernica by Pablo Picasso, Second World War, inspired, or more recently unknown by Banksy in the Ukraine. And then also you have pieces, artworks, like this one here, The Fountain of Exhaustion by Pavlo Makov, which was not inspired by war, but it became quite famous and quite well covered because of war, because of the special circumstances and so on. So in this sense, kind of war perhaps indirectly added to the fame of an artist, and perhaps it did so also in the past. Now, moving away from anecdotal evidence, let's have a look at some data here. So you could look at about 150 famous music composers from mostly in the 19th and 20th century, and see their age productivity profile. So essentially, how much have they been composing throughout their lives? During times of peace, this is the solid blue line. So in the 20s, the productivity increases. It peaks in the late 30s, and then, as myself, we are on the downturn. And this you could contrast with times or with the lives or years of composers who experience a defensive war and a defensive international war. Here, the productivity increases much sharper, much quicker, and remains above the productivity of a composer during times of peace. In contrast to this, the offensive wars, they are associated with a lower productivity, less is composed, and it remains so throughout. There are many other, well, there are many major negative effects of war, and I guess once we kind of move down the line, we could at some stage also consider, well, what happens to the location and careers of artists, right? It's not the first concern when it comes to war, but once you move down the line, you could perhaps wonder, well, what about, you know, geographic clusters? What about migration? What about the careers of artists, of music composers in particular? And what the data tells us is that music composers are well, very mobile, more mobile than the average population in times of war. The creatives are among the first ones to leave if war takes place in a given place. Second, the choice of a destination country during war-induced migration is inefficient in the sense that the composers would usually not migrate in times of war to a place which maybe would be beneficial to their career, into a place where there is a thriving arts and cultural scene. Instead, they move to places that they are familiar with, that maybe are nearby or where they have been before, and this can negatively affect the career prospects of the artist. Second, outmigration substantially and permanently decreases the country's creative potential in the long run, right? I mean, look at Paris. Paris would have, I would argue, it would have remained a top cluster, a top destination for music if the Second World War had not happened, if the big outflow of artists from Paris did not happen. Some returned, but many have not. And this brings me to like another thought here. Well, while the country involved in warfare kind of suffers and their potential, decreases, the receiving countries have the opportunities to perhaps benefit from the incoming inflow. This is how New York really, became a major location after many of the World War II induced migrants arrived there. The last topic here for today, before I conclude, is on teachers and the role of teachers in particular, and their creative influence. And I think quite a fascinating figure is this one here. It's a bit kind of like unsettling almost. This is showing you the generations of teachers and students, beginning with a not very well known French composer, Jean Mouton, who had one student. Actually, he was a bit more influential, Villard, but then the students of students and students of students and so on, and all these generations, in these generations of students, you observe well, more than 10,000 composers, more than half of famous music composers. You observe from Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Brahms to Stravinsky. Is really a huge a pyramid here of these teacher-student networks. What maybe would be then asked by some are questions perhaps like this here. So what is a teacher's influence, or creative influence, on her student? Perhaps I should have said here also one, because most of the data on music composers is actually about male, but there are some unusual, very big female stars. So about here in the about 12 generations or so, we have Nadia Boulanger, a female music composer who had an incredible number of students. She taught, as it is recorded, more than 400 students. the second most prominent composer teacher, a male, had less than half of this. So the role of female composers, while not kind of immediately observed, is very significant, even if a bit hidden. But coming back to the issue of influence, does a teacher influence her student? How durable is this influence? And maybe another question, is influence even a good thing? And these are questions that I've tried to answer in a paper that is, again, slightly perhaps more technical, but the idea is very, very simple. So essentially, I have collected data on more than 17,000 musical themes, and I have collected some key attributes of each of these outputs. Key attributes such as the key signature, time signature, the sequence of music notes. And then what I'm able to do with this, I'm able to calculate similarity between pairs of composers. So if all you were composers, you know, we would have a bunch of measures for my style. For each one of you, I could then calculate how similar am I, or how similar is my work, or perhaps a single composition to the work or the composition of Ola and of Andrea and so on. And then the empirical question is essentially, well, if Ola was my teacher, am I more similar to her than to, you know, anybody else in the room? So not so complicated is the idea. And what emerges here from this are a couple of, I think, very interesting insights. So first of all, as you would expect, a teacher influences their student. This influence persists actually quite long, over up to 20 years. The student kind of is impregnated, influenced with the style of the teacher before she or he manages to kind of depart and, you know, choose or compose in a different way. This influence is large enough to persist into the next 1 or 2 generations. So if I was a teacher, my students, and even in the 3rd generation, students would be more similar to me than to other contemporaneous composers in the future around them. And then I think quite fascinating, and, you know, a word of caution perhaps, is that it is important to realize who do we imitate, or who is our teacher. Imitating, being more similar to a high quality teacher is conducive to our career, but if our teacher is, you know, low, bottom quality teacher, our career chances deteriorate. So I think it's important, you know, it is important to be careful in the choice of the role models. I will summarize now. So we have observed here, I think, roughly speaking, 2 types of influences. One, these are the you know, influences that I'm you know, comfortable with, which an individual can influence. So the choice of a teacher, the choice or the decision to migrate somewhere, or to locate in a geography clusters. So these factors that are in the hands of an individual, of a music composer, determine his or her success, his or her creativity. But there is also the other group of factors which are outside our hands, such as incidents of a war, or well, I haven't spoken much about this, but an unexpected death in a family member, which affects negative emotions. So there are also these negative effects, or these, you know, outside of our hands situations that determine creativity. Now, I don't have much time to argue the external validity of these projects, but I do spend in each of the papers actually quite a bit of time arguing why this could be relevant for nowadays. But if you just believe for a minute that one could learn something of relevance for nowadays from this, then we should probably say, well, first of all, we need to support interaction between artists, between individuals, because these peer effects are what determine creativity and their careers. Fostering artistic clusters, this is where the interaction happens, is also a good idea. Measuring and predicting well-being based on written or orally communicated correspondence appears to be possible, and could be used in a variety of other projects. Having a greater tolerance for states of depression could also be here highlighted. Of course, nobody is saying to make artists sad and depressed. Probably they are sad and depressed enough on average due to many other reasons, but understanding that from these states of depression actually often something good can emerge, something positive, which I think is a realization that comes with many benefits. The cost of war, of course, is much bigger, much wider than one could think. If we push or consider the cost of war in the culture and artistic sphere, well, you know, losing permanently or losing an artistic center, an artistic cluster, is a very big cost. Some people, artists, scientists, they try to make an impact and, you know, be kind of significant, you know, obtain many citations or paint beautiful paintings, and they commit their life to do this. But it could be sometimes that via teaching when the greatest influence is made. And finally, this interdisciplinary, well, you could say creative if you like it, or unorthodox, bizarre, strange approaches that I have presented here, could be not only, you know, ways to obtain some new knowledge, but could be also perhaps of relevance to policy making nowadays, perhaps, especially cultural policy. Thank you very much. More papers or all the underlying papers are in the slides. I think they will be distributed, but also on my website, and I'm more than happy to take your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Karol, very much. It was really dense. I hope we can treat cultural economists like composers, so that if we support interaction between cultural economists, then we support our creativity and productivity. We have a couple of minutes for questions, so yeah, Pavel.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful, exciting talk. It is great to hear from you, because when I was starting to study cultural economics, I wrote a text for music historians that was entitled "How Economists Write Music History," and it was also about you.
Great. Oh.
So thank you, and I have a few comments from the musicological perspective, because now I am primarily a musicologist. So first, it comes to the question of the effect that there is a small number of Polish composers in the data set. It is because of us musicologists who are not ready to provide you with a good data. And I think that the data set might be very much improved if you take into consideration, for example, Polish PWM music encyclopedia, because Grove does not have as much information about Central European music composers as the national sources have. The other thing is the subject of clustering and productivity, the causality here. I just want to give an example of Chopin, who benefited from both. So, and the relation go both ways, because he of course benefited from being in Paris and clustering with other composers and the creative exchange, but he composed in retreat in Nyon when he had peace and time. So I think that there is a balance needed always, and that both retreat and connection is beneficial to creativity. The third thing is that that the causal effect of negative emotion on creative output, I think it is much more qualitative than quantitative. And it is very important to remember that what Mozart composed when he was depressed was great music, and in comparison to other works in his output. And much greater, I would argue, that the things that he composed when he was happy, or maybe we tend to like these things more because we like the art that lifts us up, like that kind of music. And the last thing is about the measuring creativity and style based on letters and other data. Perhaps you know about it, but there is a wonderful area of digital humanities around Josquin studies, and they have great tools to measure and compare stylistic similarities between composers based on large samples of music. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, can I respond very briefly?
Yeah,
or,
sure.
or do you prefer to take more questions?
Maybe we'll just
okay,
collect.
perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Karol. My congrats to your sophisticated and fascinated work. I'm quite familiar with this, and sometimes I'm very proud of your research, but sometimes I have this moment when I start to think that some of your findings can be misunderstood and used to sustain or support this stupid stereotype of starving and good artists and creative artists. This stereotype really is so widespread, and it really doesn't help me to fight for a better situation, economic and social situation of artists, as you know. So maybe you can say some words about it. It's crucial.
Yes.
Thank you. I think we should start responding.
Okay.
Oh, okay, Monica, thank you. Okay.
Thank you. As always, I'm fascinated by Karol's work, and I have to note down some of a few new things I want to show to our geography and spatial management students as well, because there was a lot of geography also in your presentation. But I had the same moment of stopping and thinking as Professor Ilchuk. I think that on the one hand, I think cultural economists can inform cultural policies to a large extent through larger data sets, through this broader outlook. But I think it's very dangerous if it's not combined with qualitative research. And I just want to give you two examples here. The first is support interaction between artists. That's great, but we also have qualitative research which shows that actually interactions with other people, artists from other artistic genre, let's say musicians interacting with visual artists, etc., this may be more important, or with ordinary people. Yeah. So combining this, we've done such research, and this was very interesting, that indeed on the city level you need this number of artists who are there from the same genre, but at the same time you need the interaction. And second thing, fostering clusters. To policymakers, that sounds fantastic, let's build artist centers, let's do whatever. But then on the city level, again, there is this question, where does this interaction happen? And then you need this qualitative research to show that perhaps this archetypal, again, cafes and bars are not necessarily places where real, true artistic innovation happens. So, and the last thing is, maybe for artists, the stereotype of depression and productivity is great, but I think for most people it's not. So again, we have to be very careful about this. So just as much as it's really, really fascinating. So
Thank you, Monica.
So if you allow me just a minute or two to respond here, Pavel, thanks very much for these insightful comments, and I'd love to read more about your work. Indeed, this is only a growth base, kind of leading international work. The problem, of course, is, you know, if Polish musicologists do not write in English into these dictionary sources, we will not know internationally about this, right? We will not know about all these great composers who are not covered here. So only a big, you know, encouragement to keep on writing there. Chopin and many others indeed had, you know, phases of working in the periphery versus in a geographic cluster, and all I can say here is an average, right? You know, this is a kind of, you know, it's a sort of a macro approach where we, you know, study all these whatever 500 or 15,000 composers and see what happens on the average, right? As a policymaker, you care about the average. As an artist, you care about yourself, right? But here we are kind of, you know, taking a step back here. Mozart, there was, oh yeah, digital humanities, absolutely fascinating things are happening here. So also I think also in the last maybe only 5 years or so, right? So it really coincided with my work here on this here. I also started working on this about 6-7 years ago, trying to kind of capture here the key attributes. But now, you know, really nice big data emerges here as well. I have not spoken, Dorota, about the starving artists. It's actually on my kind of research, you know, project ideas to kind of relate creativity and well, income or you know, the economic situation of an artist. I think it's a very big, very important topic, right? Here, obviously, we are kind of using a very biased sample, the top, those who made it, often not during their lifetimes. Often they, you know, became prominent after, but in any case, this is not the average individual, right? These are those who perhaps we are most interested in nowadays because they contributed to the cultural heritage, classical music canon, as much as very few others. But the starving artists, certainly, it's, you know, you say it's a myth, but looking even contemporary at you know, data, secondary occupations of artists, musicians, and so on, it is often there, right? But I think it's something we can talk maybe more.
Just one remark.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't mention that this is the myth of starving artists.
No. Yeah.
I think that this is stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
That only the starving artist can be very creative artist.
Okay, I see what you say. Yeah. Well, not necessarily, right? I mean, you have like Johann Sebastian Bach, who maybe, you know, became famous afterwards, or Antonio Salieri during his lifetime, famous and later not so famous. So, you know, I think it can go either way. But I think also a more thorough analysis here would be useful. Now, I haven't spoken why people benefit in a geography cluster, and indeed, qualitative research I think is very often needed. I mean, I understand something about working with data, not about music history or the single cases, but it's maybe a first step, right? You kind of provide a bigger picture, but then you need scholars who kind of really look at this local and specific case studies and so on, so qualitative research, in order to perhaps exploit what drives the increased creativity. It could be indeed the diversity, right? You mentioned your studies and some studies. Jacobs and Urban, a scholar from the 60s, a very influential. Well, she argued that actually it's this kind of diversity that makes firms more creative, and in the context of artists, indeed, these interactions have been often happening. Perhaps I will finish with this quote here, how Hector Berlioz writes to his sister Adele about how they had a little country outing. His friends came, including famous musicians, Liszt, Hiller, Chopin, but also poets, and they discussed everything from art, poetry, thought, music, drama, in everything that constitutes life. So indeed, inspiration could be drawn also from this wider approaches. And talking about everything of importance for life, a coffee is always good. for
Yes.
this, right?
Yes, it's time. Thank you, Karol, very much. It was really great to have this lecture, and also thank you for your liveliness. I treat it as a challenge to keep this tension throughout the day. And now I invite you for the coffee break. We meet 10 past 11.
Thank you.